Finally today, America just marked the 50th anniversary of Roe versus Wade. That was the landmark Supreme Court decision that legalized abortion nationwide. That is, until the Dobbs decision of 2022 ruled the Constitution does not confer a right to abortion. The decision lets states decide whether women will or will not have a right to choose. Abortion was a prominent issue during the midterm elections that year, fresh off that court ruling. But what about this year's elections? Peter Hancock from Capital News, Illinois, spoke with political science professors Brian Gaines from University of Illinois and E.J. Fagan from University of Illinois at Chicago. They spoke about how an increasing number of states banning or severely limiting access to abortion could have an impact at the ballot box. First, Brian Gaines explains abortion has frequently been an issue that's motivated voters on both sides.
It's been a constant presence in American elections. It's been very big in some. It hasn't always been big. There's a set of voters. When you ask what was the basis of your vote, there's a pretty small set of voters who will say abortion in every election since then. Some of them are saying abortion rights. They're on the pro-choice side. They're on the left. Some are on the right. They're the pro-life voters saying abortion drives my vote entirely. I'm not thinking about guns. I'm not thinking about foreign policy. I'm picking on my candidate on the basis of abortion. But it hasn't been the top issue in every election. What's striking about it, I think, is that it's those voters are always there. They haven't gone away, and that the parties over this period, 50 years is a long time. I'm fond of saying 50 weeks is a long time in politics. Even 50 days is pretty long. So those 50 years saw a really dramatic separation of the parties. There used to be people on both sides of the abortion issue in both parties, quite a lot of Democrats, particularly with sort of the blue-collar electorate, maybe fairly religious voters, lots of Catholics in the district, who were opposed to abortion, and lots of Republicans, and maybe some of them in the more suburban, affluent districts who were essentially pro-choice Republicans. Both of those are endangered species now. The parties are almost completely sorted.
Well, and maybe it's fair to say that it's been more of an issue in some parts of the country than in other parts of the country, some congressional districts versus others, gubernatorial races. EJ, let me go to you. Brian was talking about how there has been this block of sort of single issue voters, whether they were pro-choice or pro-life. Were they roughly the same size? Did one dominate the other, or did they sort of cancel each other out?
Yeah, I mean, abortion didn't affect a lot of elections directly, over that period because it was a very closely divided issue. But one thing about an electoral impact of a policy issue that we think about as political scientists is we think about the visibility of that policy issue. That low visibility issues often have a muted impact on voters because most voters aren't paying very close attention. The voters that are paying very close attention, they're partisans. And they are already divided on the issue. But most voters are not partisans. Most voters, try to avoid politics at all times. And so what Roe v. Wade did was it kept the issue off the agenda. Elections had very few stakes on abortion. So if Republicans were elected in a state that were very pro-life, it did not radically change the availability of abortion services, or at least didn't have a huge visible impact on the availability of abortion services in that state. And then Dobbs happens. And all of a sudden, all of those stakes are real. And all of these Republicans who have been promising a very unpopular policy position or a position that was revealed to be unpopular, which is very, very harsh restrictions on abortion, very strong penalties for people who perform abortions, all of a sudden that becomes real to voters. And I think that's what changes in 2022. And I think we see a very real impact on elections.
Let me ask, the way it sorted voters, the way people in favor of of abortion rights sort of gravitated toward Democrats. People opposed to abortion gravitated toward Republicans, and painting with a very broad brush here. That wasn't universally true, although I think it became more true as time went on. Was that kind of sorting, was that inevitable? Was it inevitable that the pro-choice people would gravitate toward Democrats and the pro-life people would gravitate to Republicans, or did the parties sort of engineer that on their own?
It was both. It was engineered both by the sorting of groups into parties. So you had this unsorted group before Roe v. Wade. You had evangelical Christians that were largely demobilized, that were not voting on the grounds of evangelical Christians. The Christian right did not exist. And one thing that Paul Weyrich, who was a Republican activist, he founded the Heritage Foundation, and others realized immediately after Roe v. Wade was that there was an opportunity here to make that a very powerful group for Republicans. And it became very powerful for Republicans under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. It was kind of the heyday of their group, of their power. But even today, evangelical Christians are still the most powerful organized interest within the Republican Party. I mean, if you look at who replaced Kevin McCarthy a few months ago, it was not a business guy from the Chamber of Commerce. It was essentially the leader of evangelical Christians in the United States Congress. But I would look at the Ford administration, the last administration that's a pro-choice Republican administration. Betty Ford was a leader on abortion rights. She was a leader on the Equal Rights Amendment. That's a different future you could imagine, and I think you have a very different electoral coalitions if that's the case. But that's not the way we went, and I think that today this is as polarized as any issue in American politics.
Brian, is it still an issue, or do you think maybe people have sorted themselves out over the last 50 years to such an extent that it's really not going to make that much difference in a presidential race?
I'm very uncomfortable predicting the 2024 presidential election. It's such a weird entity. I wrote an op-ed recently saying, it's possible Donald Trump could be convicted and denied bail before voting. I don't think it's going to happen. I think we'll see some delays. But he's got so many legal cases. There are so many other things to talk about. I think Republicans will be talking a lot about whether Joe Biden cognitively and stamina and other terms is capable of being president. Is he already letting other people make the decisions? He's a figurehead, keeping an incredibly light schedule. Democrats will be saying incessantly, Donald Trump is a dire threat to democracy, not a little threat. We know just how dangerous he is. We cannot let this man have power. Abortion could easily be crowded out in that world, and then events might intervene in a way that it doesn't get talked about.
That was political science professors E.J. Fagan from University of Illinois Chicago and Brian Gaines from the University of Illinois. They spoke with Peter Hancock of Capital News, Illinois. According to a recent Reuters Ipsos poll, 70% of Americans said protecting abortion access in their state would be an important issue in determining their vote in November. And about half of Americans said they would support a law legalizing abortion nationwide, including close to 1/3 of Republicans.